Another Green World is one of my favorite Eno albums. Absolutely. It's a tour de force, and I don't think anybody would disagree. There's a certain beautiful appreciation of the role of the miniature, which I think in Influence, you know, the more melodic Satie pieces, Debussy, you almost look to the classical music of late 19th century France, really, and this sense of creating small moments. And to me, that's just perfect.
Eno at that point was making electronic music that wasn't abrasive or any of the things you associate with the 60s electronic composers like Stockhausen. It was quite lulling, quite sort of sedative, and you know, I think a lot of people had a problem with that and thought it was too tranquil, almost like Muzak. He's doing this music that's kind of like just fading away into this sort of twilight zone, and so it's very, it's sort of coming out of psychedelia in a way, out the more dreamy, dejected side of psychedelia that you get with certain Pink Floyd songs, but it's also looking ahead to ambient music, which is very much about kind of surrender and the individual blending into the environment and sort of fading away, losing a sense of yourself. So it's a really, it's a really radical record.
During the same period, Eno was also working on an equally radical concept for a record label. The release of Another Green World in September '75 was the first signal to his audience that a new Eno was emerging, one who would be moving even further from the conventions of rock and attempting to take them with him. His long-haired, androgynous appearance of the Roxy days was morphing into a modest and academic image more befitting an avant-garde composer. And Obscure Records was the real evidence that Eno's interests lay outside of the rock world. A concept developed over time with his Portsmouth Symphonia colleague Gavin Bryars, it was a label focused on promoting the work of experimental composers and would eventually release 10 titles between 1975 and 1978. Despite their initial reservations, Island Records agreed to manufacture and distribute the results of this experiment.
The Obscure label's significance is completely under-heralded. It gave the first exposure to Gavin Bryars on record, to Michael Nyman, the Penguin Cafe Orchestra, etc.
Album series of 10 records that persuaded Island Records to put out in the early 70s is possibly the single most important thing he did for the European and American avant-garde. What he was doing was basically opening the doors to hundreds of thousands of people, to the avant-garde, to this music that had been struggling underneath the mainstream for years and never been heard.
Among the experimental composers whose work had thus far been unheard outside of the avant-garde underground were John Adams, Michael Nyman and Harold Budd, all of whom would become major names in modern composition. Eno had a hand in the production of all of the LPs and was intent on finding suitable material and even relatively unknown artists within the experimental field itself. David Toop, whose work was captured on the 4th Obscure Records release, was one such composer.
It was a big jump, to suddenly be in Basing Street Studios. In this big studio, and given, not much time, a few days, but given some time in a studio like that with an experienced producer, Brian, and an experienced engineer, Rhett Davis, and the opportunity to make some work in that situation. Yeah, it was great, of course. Suddenly you had a position to work from. The records were reviewed and people were baffled by them, or they liked them, or they hated them, or whatever, but there they were. They weren't something that was just a little gig somewhere that you could totally ignore and say it was nothing to do with the rest of the world. And yeah, that was a great initiative. You could say that Brian really caught the zeitgeist, and in some respects by accident. You know, he was getting advised, of course, but he was in a pivotal position. You know, he was in this world where he had power, and you know, let's face it, most of the artists, all of the artists on Obscure had very little power in that sense at that time. For all of us, it presented our work to a much bigger audience. And I look back now and I think as an A&R decision, it was pretty solid. That idea of channeling this very, obscure, sometimes difficult music through the same channel that everybody else who was very successful and famous was going through was quite revolutionary.
Well, the fact that his name was on it, I think, allowed a lot of people who never would have listened to this art music, gave them sort of permission to go out and buy these albums. It made them curious. They wouldn't have gone out and bought a None Such album, you know. There were recordings being made of some of these very composers, John Cage and others, but nobody was aware of them except the obscure avant-garde music collectors. So that crossing of bridges and using his imprimatur to get these things made, I'm sure that the only people who bought them were other musicians, really, or people who became other musicians. I'm sure that a lot of people bought these albums. A handful of people thought it was the first, beautiful note they'd ever heard in their life, and other people are, what is this boring music? I think that we need these wonderful windows to discover things.
And this window also gave Eno the opportunity to release work of his own that entirely fell outside of the domain of popular music. Obscure's third release was Discrete Music, an album on which he continued to develop his unique artistic approach. The second half of the LP was made up of deconstructions of Pachelbel's Canon in D major, one of Eno's most beloved works, notated and conducted by Gavin Bryars. Yet it was the A-side's title track that spotlighted his singular vision of the potential of technology and chance.
Eno had set up these machines to make music by themselves. It was the fullest realization of Eno's interest in cybernetics and systems. He had actually built this system that made music, and that made pretty interesting, beautiful sounding music.